Brad Holmes spoke at the NFL Combine today. It has been a while since we've heard from Brad Holmes about his offseason plans. And without going into great detail on exactly what the offseason plans are going to look like, he did give us some insight before we get everything started. So let's get right into it. As always, before we get into today's video, got to give a shout out to our sponsor of today's video, and that is BetUS. Use code YouTube150 to get your 150% deposit match on your first deposit, 125% on your next two deposits up to $2,000. Currently, the odds are out for a lot of free agents, like where guys are going to end up, who are they going to be playing for week one of the next season. And I just thought this was super interesting to see some of these names. Like Joey Bosa is the favorite to end up with the Detroit Lions, which is very interesting. It can make some sense. I understand how he gets there. Lions are also pretty high. If you go up a little bit to Khalil Mack, you can see that they're within the top five here. Was that fifth? They're fifth here. So the Lions are on a couple of these lists if you want to jump in on these. Deebo Samuel, not as high, pretty low on that one. But I thought this was super interesting because we're in that free agency mode. And if you want to get in on the action, this is the place to do it. Cooper Kupp's listed here as well. We'll just leave it right there, man. So, Detroit Lions plus 4,000. There's actually some people are betting on this. I don't know. Use code YouTube150, man. Shout to BetUS. Now let's get to today's video. So I wasn't sure if I was going to make this video or not today. I didn't know if there was enough there to do a full video on. However, the more I thought about it, I was like, yes, we should touch on this because I can expand a little bit. I can really expand on the Philadelphia Eagles conversation because we continue to hear Myles Garrett. The name continues to get brought up, whether that's with Lions fans or other fans around the NFL. Is he going to be traded? The Browns continue to come out like, yo, we're not interested in moving this guy. We don't want to move off of Myles Garrett. We want to win football games, and we don't think it's going to be the best for the Browns to move off of Myles Garrett. And then there's all the financial responsibility that comes into play, which is really the biggest thing here. I think just trade value is draft capital is one thing, but I think a lot of teams would get this done if it was just draft capital. It's the fact that you're probably going to have to pay Myles Garrett, and it's also what it's going to cost the Cleveland Browns just to move off of Myles Garrett if it's a pre-June 1st trade. However, we continue to hear different teams get thrown into this conversation, and most recently I heard Philadelphia, according to some rumors, get thrown into this conversation alongside Jonathan Allen getting permission to seek a trade from Washington. And while Brad Holmes didn't directly comment on the Myles Garrett situation, he did talk about acquiring players by trade this offseason and how difficult it is to pull off. But what it got me to thinking after kind of reading through the comment section of some of these posts is the difference between the Lions and the Eagles. Apparently, this is going to be very possible, and they might pull this off. How have they built this, and how is it different from the Lions? Is there steps that the Lions are missing along the way? Like, what's the difference between these two teams? And actually, what I came to realize is it's super interesting. The Lions and Eagles feel like they're on very similar paths because really the first season that Philadelphia started nailing their top draft picks was 2021. And the Detroit Lions and Brad Holmes started in 2021, and they've kind of done the exact same thing. Both of these teams have pretty much for the most part nailed their top draft picks in the NFL since that time, and they found some little pieces throughout the rest of the draft. But I just wanted to focus at the top because I think when you really start to look at how Philly has gotten to where they are, we put some context to it, it's more understandable, and you can look at the Lions and say, okay, this idea that the Lions are like, man, they have to make this move, or maybe there's a gap or something, like there's this massive gap between what Philly's doing and everybody else. Let's start here first, and then we'll kind of go back through the way that Brad Holmes actually spoke on everything. But I wanted to get right into this because he spoke about basically pulling the trigger on one of these big-name pass rushers. He was asked about this a couple of times, but just speaking on pulling the trigger on a big-name pass rusher, and he talked about how it's hard, one, to keep those players financially, and he directly mentioned that they have one of those guys coming up, a top-tier pass rusher, which would be Aiden Hutchinson, that they are already financially planning to pay. And then it's like when you pay a second one, first off, can we even do it? And then obviously we've talked about kind of the lack of flexibility that comes along with making that kind of trade. And then he also expanded on something like this. And again, he was never speaking directly about Myles Garrett, but expanding on, the idea and the notion of the Lions being one pass rusher away, which I don't agree with. I've already stated that this offseason. But then he kind of went on to say, well, why not two? Why not three? Why not four? Right? Why is that not the conversation? Because that's what he wants to acquire. He wants to acquire 2, 3, or 4 great pass rushers. He doesn't just want to have one, but he also understands how difficult it is to do that. What if that player gets hurt? But let's assume he doesn't get hurt, for example, because obviously that's the big risk, right? That's where I'm at with it. I mean, if a guy like Myles, even though you don't see anything historically, if he gets hurt, now you're in a really tough spot because you invested so much there. You don't have a lot of flexibility. If you have to give him that new contract, you lose a lot of flexibility to use Myles Garrett, for example. But he's like, well, let's say he doesn't get hurt, but what if what happens to us last season happens again? And we have all of this attrition and everybody's beat up. And even if you have that new acquired piece, Is it enough? Is it still enough at that point to get you to where you want to be? Or at that point, are there certain pieces that you had to necessarily not keep because you made this kind of move? So now all of a sudden, maybe you lost some of that depth, for example, and that attrition kills you, and that one new piece isn't the piece that's going to put you over the top. They can stay on the path they're on and get to a Super Bowl and win a Super Bowl. But what got me to thinking about this was looking at it from the Philly perspective. What has Philadelphia done that maybe we haven't done? And we all know it starts to the draft, and I know they've drafted incredibly well. And how far apart are our defensive fronts from one another? Well, first things first, Philadelphia has a couple guys set to be free agents. So them making a move like this can also coincide with the fact that they have Milton Williams, who's set to get paid a lot this offseason, finally had his breakout year in the NFL, year 4 for him after being a third-round pick back in their first draft. It just took him, really 4 years to break out this past season. He was awesome. I've always been a fan of Milton Williams, but this year he took off, and now it looks like he's going to get paid a ton of money. He probably won't be brought back. You also have a guy like Josh Sweat, who's also set to become a free agent this next coming season, so that could leave them with some room to make a move like this actually make sense because they're losing out on 2 big-name pass rushers this offseason potentially. As Brad Holmes also said today in the press conference is always building through the trenches. He believes that's where the game's won. He's always going to put an emphasis on offensive line, defensive line. We know that's going to continue. He did that since the year that he's gotten here, and he's done that. But the weird similarities between the Lions and Eagles stand out. Like, if you look at the Eagles over the since 2021, they've essentially hit on all of their first or second round picks, right? So you have Devontae Smith and Landon Dickerson the first year. And then they also threw in Milton Williams year 3, which, again, he just broke out this past season, kind of the year 3 breakout. You go to 2022, you had Jordan Davis, you had Cam Jurgens, right? They hit on both those picks. Jordan Davis, there may be some questions, but they hit on both of those. 2023, Jalen Carter, Nolan Smith. Remember, they moved one spot with Chicago to land Jalen Carter at pick number 9. There were some off-the-field questions, but we all knew he was amazing. All right, he was my favorite player in the draft. They took Jalen Carter. And then this past year, Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean, who definitely had a big year 1 impact for them. Which right away, I was like, that's weirdly similar to the Lions and how their drafts have been since 2021. If you go back to the Lions drafts, year 1, it was Penei Sewell, who's definitely a hit. Levi Onwuzurike, who feels like he kind of just had that year 4 breakout like Milton Williams, just kind of in a backwards order. And Ali McNeil. It's like, all right, we hit on all of those picks. 2022 was Aiden Hutchinson, Jameson Williams, and Josh Paschal. Josh Paschal would be the one that I'd circle there and say, I wouldn't say that it's an absolute, surefire hit. I think he's been a plus player for us, but I wouldn't consider him in that category. Maybe you could say that about a guy like Jordan Davis, for example, as well. So Josh Paschal is kind of maybe the one that doesn't fit into this. 2023, Jahmyr Gibbs, Jack Campbell, Sam Laporta, Brian Branch knocked all of those picks, literally all 4 of those picks out of the park. They all feel like first-round value, and even Brad Holmes said today that, looking at these guys that we have to pay long-term, we have all these first-round picks, but then you also have these second-round guys that we had graded as first-round picks at the time. We believed that they were first-round value. We just got them in the second round, and clearly it played out like that. And then this past year, we went Terrion Rakestraw. Now, Rakestraw, we didn't see as much. Cooper DeJean, we did see. Rakestraw had a little bit of an injury. For us, it was kind of based on how our depth chart was aligned, and also kind of the roles a little bit different potentially for those two. But regardless, even when you just look at the personnel the Lions brought in, Lions went heavy O-line, heavy D-line for the since 2021, up until this past season where it went cornerback. If you look at Philly, it's been majority O-line, D-line outside Devontae Smith until this past year where we went cornerback. And I think about that, and it's like, okay, clearly these teams have a similar way of thinking. They both want to build through the trenches. We're seeing that with the value that they place. They both draft very well at the top since 2021 because before that they were a little bit hit and miss. But also, I think what people forget about context is where Philadelphia has been picking. And this is where the separator is going to come into play. Because I talk about those 2024 picks. And while Terrion, as Brad Holmes said, he felt like the waters kind of calmed about halfway through the season, I felt like that too. He had some great games. Thought he got a lot better. There was ups, there was downs throughout the season. Figure something out. It's like, that's a good improvement. And then something else would pop up. You're like, that's messy. And then he'd fix it. It just was kind of that process all year. But I'm very optimistic about Terrion. I love Terrion Arnold coming out of the draft. He was my favorite cornerback in the draft. So I was pumped we got him. The big thing that I circle here is what 2024 is. Because this was really, if you look at Philly's last few drafts, kind of the first idea of both us and them, like picking later. Now, remember, they picked higher than us because they were a first-round exit. We went to the NFC Championship game, so that's championship game that year. So there's already a little bit of a gap between the picks, but we both went DB. A lot of that to me was how the draft was probably set up. Like you looked at where the strengths were in that draft, it was where that was. It was a heavy offensive draft, so those guys fell. Lions trade up to go get their guy, right? So it fit the strengths of the draft. But the point is both teams have had the same kind of idea, build O-line, D-line. They've done it every year, and both teams have been very successful at it. But Philly got a lot of early production out of those 2024 picks. The Lions got a good production out of Terran Arnold. Rakestraw, we just didn't see that much. But I think that's kind of a foreshadow, of course, of what both of these teams are typically going to have to deal with going forward. Because if you look at Philly, they haven't nailed all of these draft picks at 31 and 32 year after year. Even with good records, they haven't. I forgot about the New Orleans Saints trade. I looked back at it today and was like, what a disaster. Like, this is, I don't even want to call it a disaster, but I mean, it's an absolute steal what it turned into. Philly's best, arguably, defensive player is Jalen Carter. And they ended up landing Jalen Carter because they got the 10th pick from the New Orleans Saints. Because Philadelphia and New Orleans made a blockbuster trade at the time, which I remember the buzz was like, is Saints going to take a quarterback? They didn't take a quarterback, but they got 2 first-round picks. They went O-line and receiver. They went Penning and they went Chris Olave, which, however we wanted to look at that. But for the Eagles, what it meant is they got a future first-round pick, and because the Saints were a disaster, it turned into a top 10 pick in the NFL draft. They ended up flipping one spot with Chicago, and they land Jalen Carter. So when you look at it, like, it was a heck of a play by their GM. Like, no discredit there. But you're talking about first-round picks that were the 10th pick in the draft, that were the 13th pick in the draft, that were the 9th pick in the draft. And now it's kind of the next step for both teams where, okay, what is that going to look like as teams are typically going to be picking now in the back end? And maybe there's not a second first-round pick attached to it. And I think when you look at that, it just makes it feel like, okay, there's actually a lot of similarities. And then even if you just looked at the rosters from last season, as Brad continued to kind of bring up, the fact that the attrition was such a problem last year, as we know that it was. But if you looked at it from a production standpoint, like how far off are the Lions personnel-wise? Let's look at last season. Ali McNeil versus Jalen Carter. Carter, you can give the nod to. I love Jalen Carter, but he put up 53 pressures last season, 36 hurries on 541 pass rush snaps. Ali McNeil, who did not play the full season, which was a massive loss, put up 45 pressures, 8 less, 2 more hurries in 439 pass rush snaps. So you could argue that he had a more productive, specifically from a pass rush perspective, season. Now, both teams are different. Lions have a much higher pressure rate, but they also blitz at a much higher rate. Like, if you compared a guy like, of course, Aiden Hutchinson, there's really no comparison on the Philly side. Hutchinson, who also missed time, had 45 pressures literally in 4.5 games this past season. He was the best pass rusher in football. There's no one really comparable on a game-by-game thing there for Philadelphia, unless you want to throw a guy like Sweat into the mix, again, who had 54 pressures on 408 snaps. It's not comparable, so obviously we would have the nod there. And then you have to go on to kind of what's the third, right? What's the third option? And that's where I think Philly, clearly their depth plays out, because you could go to like Za'Darius, who we only had for half the season, and unfortunately we couldn't combine kind of like Philly did, where it was like, oh, you have Carter and you got Nolan Smith and you got Sweat on the field. It was Za'Darius. It wasn't Za'Darius and Aleem. It wasn't Za'Darius and Hutch. It wasn't Za'Darius, Aleem, and Hutch. It was Za'Darius and Levi, right? That's what it was because of injury. So we didn't get kind of that multiplying factor. But even with that being said, Za'Darius still put up 40 pressures as a Lion alone. And if you look at it from just a regular season perspective, he did put up 63 pressures on the year on 421 pass rush snaps, which in comparison to a guy like Nolan Smith, he had 31 pressures on just under 300 snaps, 277 snaps. So you would, again, pressure perspective, there would be pretty similar between the two in terms of that rate. If anything, would actually go the nod, would go towards Za'Darius Smith in that conversation, though no one could be a better run defender. And then you would have to get on to kind of that next option, which is for them, they have the big body nose tackle, which is our DJ Reader. But they have kind of the backup nose, you could say, or the interior defense lineman that can also create pressure, which for them was Milton Williams' breakout year in year 4, which similar to Lions was Levi in year 4. Now, I would say Milton had a better season as a pure pass rusher than Levi. Levi was a plus player. We'll talk about this more. 45 pressures on 418 snaps. It was definitely less than Milton Williams, who had 40 pressures, but only on just over 300 snaps. So in terms of like pressure rate, pressure percentage, it was definitely higher on the Milton Williams, perspective. It just wasn't in total higher. But I think when you look at things like that, you get the idea like, okay, there's actually maybe not that massive of a gap here. They just had their guys together. We didn't have our guys together. And for them, they're losing potentially Milton. We could be losing Levi, and they're potentially losing Sweat, and we could potentially lose Za'Darius, though he's technically under contract, right? So I think when you think about it from that perspective, the idea of them making that trade makes sense because they're losing 2 big names on their line. The Lions aren't, outside of Levi, who was kind of the Milton Williams role that I wouldn't say had the Milton Williams season, but they may not lose Levi either. So it's just something to kind of keep in mind when you think about this whole process. Where do those back end of the first round picks connect? Like how well the Lions do there, all right? What are they turning those picks into? That's going to be the key going forward, because I'm obviously very hype on Terrion. I loved Rakestraw and mocked him at one point in the first round to us on Bleacher Report. It's just going to depend, what that's going to turn into, because because as of now, we don't really know. So I want to start with that. That's kind of like the main premise here. And then just to go through some of the other notes that Brad Holmes gave us today, of course, as he always says, he's not fixated on drafting position. As we've seen before, he's doubled up on D linemen. We doubled up on cornerbacks last season. He just essentially said it lined up last year where we needed that, but we've always wanted to add that. Like, it wasn't just last year. It was like the first time, like, we want to add young corners. He said that we had wanted to do that. It's just the first time it lined up. And, you know, I do buy into that to a certain extent, because when they had Mosley, when they brought Mosley in during the offseason, and then they also brought in Sutton, the idea was they were going to be the starters, but that didn't necessarily mean the Lions were going to draft somebody. I think we all kind of thought they would, and then they really didn't address it outside of Brian Branch. So he had always wanted to add to that. He just didn't feel like it lined up. So you take his word for it that he's just drafting who he thinks is the best player. It makes sense. I felt like that with Jack Campbell. It's like, do we need Jack Campbell? And obviously he's a great player, right? That one has hits. So I think about it from that perspective, and I completely agree. And I think this year's draft, most positions should be on the table. If you just look at it from pick 28, cornerback should be in consideration. Well, is it a biggest need? No, like I wouldn't make that case, but it could be in consideration. You lose Carlton this offseason. Could you consider it? Why not? And cornerback could be in a good spot where you could land some really good corners, especially if you end up moving back. We're talking about round 2, things like that. Safety could be in play, whether that's you're looking for a guy that's flexible, or maybe more so you're saying let's put Branch back in the slot because of his flexibility. Safety could be in play depending on what happens with Iffy. Obviously, D-line is loaded, and Brad even touched on it. Like, I usually don't like to give out, you know, how we feel about the draft and things like that versus other teams because it's all too subjective. But like, yeah, defensive line's loaded because interior and on the outside, a lot of really good players. And that's what this draft is full of. Like, you have so much variety that could potentially happen at the top. I mean, you go from Derek Harmon out of Oregon, who I think would be an awesome first round pick, to a guy like, you know, TJ Sanders out of South Carolina, who I had in my last mock offseason. I'm a big fan of, kind of a little bit of an undersized interior defensive lineman with great length. And then you go to a guy like Donovan Ezaraku, who I just did the video on, that's undersized, an outside linebacker, but it's 3 very different types that could all be in similar ranges depending on who you're talking to in terms of grades there. And then you have kind of the linebacker hybrids that can get after the quarterback, which, speaking of linebacker, I think linebackers should be on the table because I think you could potentially, there's a path where you could land the top linebacker in this year's draft class. And that doesn't mean, don't think about him as Jack Campbell, more so as a pass rushing potential, but a guy that could potentially replace Alex Anzalone in time, that kind of thing. Like, all of those should be on the table. Offensive line should be on the table. It's a very good offensive tackle class, which a lot of position flexibility, where if the Lions went early tackle, it could be very possible that that tackle goes guard. I mean, you think Donovan Jackson from Ohio State, he's going to be a left guard probably at the NFL. He could be a guard that goes, you know, within the top couple of rounds, but he's listed as a tackle. Gray Zabel, he played tackle, but he looks like a guard, right? His size may not consider it, but he plays like a guard. He's got the skill set for a guard. So you think about pieces like that. I mean, the only ones I really think that wouldn't be on the table is obviously quarterback, because I don't think we'd have a player that would really line up there. I don't know about running back. I like running back's depth. I'd be pretty surprised if the Lions took a running back with where they're at. Just, I understand you take best available, but they are pretty loaded there. And then even wide receiver might be really tough just because I don't know that the player will actually line up to make sense of that spot. Could be, though. I don't know what the draft board is going to look like. But as of now, I don't know that player is going to actually line up to make sense as a top pick. Trenches are going to be the priority. You think about this offseason, Levi's a free agent, Davenport's a free agent, Kevin Zeitler's a free agent. And then, of course, you got to think about the future. Like nose tackle, you think about the future of Zadarius Smith. What is that going to look like? There's a lot of players that they've identified they want to keep. And he kind of, like, I don't think he did it on purpose, but I think he pretty much exposed, like, yeah, we're going to be re-signing Kirby Joseph, or we're going to make our attempt to re-sign Kirby Joseph to a longer deal. Talking about, you know, the having those high draft picks and having to extend those guys, and that's where the money goes to. He brought up Kirby Joseph specifically as a guy that he identified as one of those young players that they want to keep around, and I assume that means that they're going to be keeping around Kirby Joseph. I think we all expect that, but I wouldn't be surprised if soon we see a deal done, because the Lions have proven they'll do that. If you come out early and you're a dog within your first 3 years, once you're available for extension, we'll jump on that. We'll save some money, which Philly also does. We'll jump on that early, save ourselves some money, because we're confident that you're a good player. And I think that Brad identifying it as we've identified good players, and he also compared it to, like, you want to keep around good players that are known versus maybe taking a shot on a player that's an unknown, especially within your own team because you haven't seen them here. And I thought that was super interesting. So when I started to think about it, like, okay, who could they classify as good? I think from what we know, just from a playing standpoint, Iffy I would classify as, we know he's a good player. Like, I would like to see him be better in man coverage, but I can tell you objectively he's a good football player. He's a very good safety. He's just injured a lot. Is he good? I think from what we've seen, there's no reason for me to believe he's not a good player. Is Levi a good player? I think Levi's a plus player. I think he had his breakout season. Levi showcased he could have those monster games like against Minnesota where they have a shaky offensive line. Has Levi proven that he's, like, no doubt very good player, lock him in long term? That, I think there's question marks. So I think about that. Don't know if that will mean anything, but I think there's question marks because he's missed so much time. He's been on the up and up, and I think this last year was a good season on its own, no doubt. Is he proven like he's, lock him in long term? I don't know about that. So I think when I think about it from this perspective, I think it makes things a lot more interesting. Obviously, we know Zeitler's a very good player. It's just an age thing there. JMO is entering like, okay, we know that this is a good player. I don't know what he means by good. I know the term that I use for good is always an above average player. I don't know how he, classifies that. In this case, all the guys that I mentioned would fall into an above average category. Even Levi. Jack Campbell, we know that he's a good player. He's just not available for extension yet. Carlton Davis, big free agent. Is he good? We know Carlton Davis is a good player. It's just kind of like if he's going to miss some time, not as extensively, but Carlton's a good player. So if we're simply looking from that perspective, which feel like the locks of, I know that's a good player, Iffy and Carlton Davis kind of feel like that to me. That's not what I'm predicting is going to happen, but it just kind of feels like that to me, that those two guys feel like locks, like, we know those are good players. Are they going to miss time? Yes, but we know they're good players. Also talked about watching this Lions defense, and we just went through some of the defensive stuff there. But, going back, he said we went through watching an Arizona free agent, which I'm, my goofy self, I'm like, all right, which Arizona free agent is he talking about? I was like, I got to think about this for a second, and we'll talk about that. But he's like, that was week 3. We gave up 13 points that game. The Lions did that game. They held, James Conner to 17 rushing yards on 9 carries. Again, the Lions defense took a huge drop, which is, again, the biggest thing I want to fix this offseason. Talk about, kind of the injuries that we've had that had something to do with that. I thought schematic had a lot to do with that as well in our last game, but that's where I want to get back on track. Every team in the NFC that was knocked out in their playoff game, they were knocked out. They all got exposed in terms of being able to stop the run. And for us, obviously, that was against Washington. Back then, he's like, man, I forgot how much that defense was humming to get an opportunity to see that, which it was when we were right? Carlton was out there, Hutch was out there. And even just to go take on his little comment, who could he have been talking about as a free agent they were watching? By the way, this doesn't mean they're targeting this guy. Keep that clear. They should be watching all these available options. Now, maybe if it's brought to Brad Holmes, there's something special that they want to discuss with him, but everybody's going to have notes on him, right? And they're still working through that, as he pointed out. But the main guys that I came to conclusion that he could have been talking about, first off, based off if they even played the Lions this year, is Greg Dortch, who feels the most likely undersized 5'7" receiver. I remember going to that one like Greg Dortch looks like the player that could be the game changer in this one. He had 3 receptions for 35 yards against us in that game, kind of a slot receiver, but I'm a fan of Greg Dortch. Then it would be probably offensive lineman. Tristan Colin, I wanted this offseason. He had a nice year again. He's projected to make a lot of money, but he plays about 300 snaps these past 2 years. For guard depth, I'd love to bring in Tristan Colin. He also plays right guard, but he didn't play against the Lions. So I don't know that they were talking about him because at that time it was actually Will Hernandez, a little bit older, about 30 years old, that was playing the Lions, and this past season played 280 snaps at right guard. I think about Zeitler, maybe he was talking about Will Hernandez, or you think about a guy like Evan Brown, who we know was a Lion, but he played left guard this past year and had a good season. So I think he was probably either talking about Dortch, he was talking about Hernandez, or he was talking about Evan Brown. That's my guess, just based on that alone. But the defense was really good. Before we lost Carlton, we were holding teams to more interceptions and touchdowns. Our passing yards per game given up were 60 less. We were giving up one of the best completion percentages in football. We allowed the lowest pass rating in football on this season. Last year, as a whole on the regular season, our run defense numbers just took a step back, which I'm hoping Casey Rogers is going to help us out with this next season as our defensive line coach. That was the big thing. Everything else was great. Pass defense has continuously trajected up. Pass rush was great, and then we lost touch, and we still maintained it. We just kind of lost everybody, and we still maintained it. We just couldn't stop the run. Like, we didn't have a good marriage when it came to the playoffs. Couldn't get after the quarterback because we didn't get him in many passing situations. Even on one of the big play that they had, we had pressure. It's just that, we got beat in the back end, but the ball was out so fast. We just didn't stop the run at all in that game. We were getting gashed in those spots.
Always thought really highly of him. I was fortunate to coach with he and Terrell, so when I knew there was a chance to get him, he was going to be available, it just made sense. I think he's going to be great for our D-line. I think Hutch and those guys are going to really like him, gravitate to him. And man, he's one of us, he's about doing it the right way, hard worker, sees the game well, understands scheme really well, and man, he knows the fundamentals.
Also talked about Tashard Choice, who was the Lions' new running back coach. He's like, I was, a little bit surprised that we were able to even land this guy, but someone that's in the drafting circles. Obviously, you're going to get a relationship with these coaches, scouting these players, and Texas constantly puts out really good running backs. So understanding, who Tashard Choice is from that alone, we went through the list of names that he worked with at Texas is insane. Also working at Georgia Tech with Jahmyr Gibbs as well, kind of mentioned that aspect. I think Tashard Choice was really sneaky to move Scotty Montgomery back to wide receiver. I think that's a heck of a pickup for the Lions.
All right, and so now he gets that whole receiver room and the pass game as well. He's going to be a huge part of our pass game, just like David Shaw is going to be. But he's going to have a huge impact. It's been run game, running backs now. Man, he's coaching more guys, and he'll have a big impact.
Chicago game. And he did say that there were a few guys in that game that they had, they grade as starting level players that were playing in that game at Chicago, and that was week 13. And in that game, I kind of went through because he was talking about the defense side of the ball, like who could he have been mentioning here that wasn't playing, because in that game, Mosley was listed out. Carlton Davis was out for that game. It's like Khalil Dorsey at that time, who I know the Lions are fans of. I don't know if they would grade him as starting level, though. I'd be a little surprised. But Kindle Vildor, I could see that. Kindle Vildor had a good season this past year, so it wouldn't surprise me that they want to bring back Vildor again. He's a free agent this offseason. David Long a little bit. Zeke Turner, I'd be a little bit surprised they had either of those guys graded as starting players, starting level players. Maybe David Long at the time. I initially was pretty excited when we brought him in. They could have had that from an outside in grade. And then also Muhammad played a good amount of snaps in that game. Muhammad's also set to be a free agent. I think Muhammad and Vildor, I think they're definitely both going to be brought back. That would be my early guess that those two guys are going to get brought back. Talked about that they've kind of had to plan out kind of these moves because there's so many good players and players that they like that they want to extend. And then the other side note was when he was asked about big spending in free agency, as he said, well, basically, what do you consider, big spending in free agency? Is that $6 million? Because that's not pocket change, which it's not. $6 million is a lot, especially for a singular season. So, I understood where he was coming from with that. Big spending, again, could the Lions make one big splash? I could see it. It just depends on who they bring back, because I think clearly he set his priority by what he said is know our good players on this team. They are known good, and not overspend on guys that are unknown within this team means that the priority is bringing guys back. So especially the more players they bring back, if they bring back three, if you bring back Iffy, Carlton, and Levi, it's going to be hard to see any kind of splash moves happening this offseason. If they bring back two of the three, I could see one splash move happening this offseason, right? If that's Zeitler and that's, Carlton Davis, a splash move that happens. And then I think it gets kind of more to the intermediate range. But 6 to 12 million, while that may be considered more intermediate, close to the 6 side, 12 side I would not consider intermediate when you're talking about per year basis. $12 million per year is a pretty big splash if you ask me. I think anything that's legitimately about over $8 million, I would classify as a splash from a year-to-year basis. I think you could throw it in that category, but that's probably going to be naturally pushed up a little bit just because of cap rising, which, by the way, the cap rising, the Myles Garrett situation, to get discussed too much, is the fact that Cleveland, I don't think, has a great incentive to trade him, depending on how much they get back. Like, they've said, we don't want to move him. But they've always left the door open, seemingly to me, of like, okay, if we had enough, like we could make this happen. The problem that they're dealing with is they have to clear cap space, because otherwise it would have to be a post-June 1st trade, which then they wouldn't get draft picks for this year, because that would save them $5 million in cap space. Or they're going to have to clear about $40 million according to Over the Cap, even after the cap number rose, because there's still negative $23 million in cap space. So once you trade him, the $18 million dead cap that counts against their charge this year puts him at negative 40. They're going to have to make a lot of moves just to move him off the roster, just so they can actually do it. And that's not talking about doing anything else, like, paying your draft class, paying anybody else in free agency. So I think for them, it's going to be financially difficult for them to make it happen. You'd rather have it done early in the process, that way you've made that move. But I think it's difficult for both sides to pull off a post-June 1st trade of something this massive. Myles Garrett, could he be traded? I think the door is always open. But will he be traded? I think for Cleveland, it's going to be difficult pulling that off. I did trade for Zadarius Smith. And if you keep Zadarius Smith around, who I would love to see with Hutch and Aleem and all of these guys that we're talking about that are under contract, you think about some of what the Lions gave up. They gave up a 5th and a 6th round pick in exchange for Zadarius and a 7th rounder. If you look at what the Lions have done with their 5th and 6th round picks over the last few years, there's reason to maybe believe both sides, but think about it. James Mitchell, a little bit on and off, but this is really the first year he's out with the Lions. He's now going to Carolina on his futures deal because his rookie contract, as we know, is expired. He was there for 4 years. James Houston was actually cut year 1, but he was brought back, and then, as we know, he was let go during this season. So he was around for a little while, about 3 years there. He was around for the Lions. And then you would have guys like Malcolm who are still here. You would have Colby Sorrell still here, but we'll see on Colby, because I don't know, how long that leash is going to be if they add more pieces this offseason as a 5th round pick. He's only been here for a couple of seasons. Most recently, then, Mekhi Wingo and Christian Mahogany, who aren't going to go anywhere anytime soon.
And look, I think there's some uniqueness when you think about draft picks. It's not like Zadarius, you know what position he's going to play. You kind of know exactly what you're going to get. But when you think about some of the draft picks, of course, like there's the Lions looking at it from, okay, we'll just try a different position. Like Sorrell was coming in as guard, and now he's working at right tackle. And then you think about some of these other pieces, James Houston, right? It was off ball, let him go. Oh, let's put him on the line of scrimmage. That might work better. They've also been creative with, like, let's see if we can find a path to make this work. They've given those guys opportunities.
So I think there's reason to believe that they could move off a guy that's a 5th and or 6th round pick, what it took to get in exchange. But we've also seen some patience. I do believe there's been some patience. And plus, Zadarius Smith put together a half a season that was not great against the run, not an enforcer against the run, but he's a very good pass rusher. And for that price point, it's hard to find guys that can do that. Probably not going to give you also the run defense aspect. They also may be much older, or it's a guy like Nikhil Von Chasen or Baron Browning. It'd be something along those kind of lines, which I wouldn't hate, but there's just not a lot of options that really fall into that direct category of I can go get after it, especially with no one opposite of me as a pass rusher. Lions, in terms of trading, with the cap space going up, I think it does make a rental trade more likely because if it's at $51 million according to over the cap, again, I don't think the concern is as much this year. It's everything beyond this year. The concern for the Lions will be the extension that they give out. I think that's clearly the biggest concern. Not even really the draft capital. It's the extension that they give out. And I think that if you could legitimately make a trade for a top pass rusher where you kind of kept him like a rental for 1 or 2 years, that's something I think the Lions could figure out because 2026, they'll restructure some deals. 2025, I think they'll be able to now financially make that happen, especially if the contract is already set. As a contract number is already going to be there for that player. Say more like a Trey Hendrickson who has the 1 year left on his deal. Max Crosby could fall in that category because he may not cost as much to bring in as a guy like Myles Garrett would cost to bring in specifically. Because I think once you pay a certain amount, then you're at a point where it's like, well, we kind of have to extend it because it's hard to, have a rental that you had to give up that many first-round picks for, multiple first-round picks for. Max Crosby could be, I think he's going to be, he'd be less than Myles Garrett. I think he would be less than Trey Hendrickson, to be honest. I think Myles Garrett would be more affordable than either of those guys in terms of draft capital given up. It's just you give him the long-term deal, it'd be kind of more of a rental. I think a guy like that makes more sense for that reason than a guy like Myles Garrett.
Which is to me why if a trade were to happen, a guy like Kwity Paye, for example, that you guys have brought up to me, would make kind of the most sense because he's on the 5th-year option. It's going to be a little bit expensive, but for a single season, and he may not have the kind of cost where you really are locked into, okay, we gave him this much to make this move, we have to extend it.
But this would be the time. If the Lions could make a trade and they want to make a trade, it would be the time to make a rental type of trade.
Although that's essentially what Za'Darius Smith is, right? There's really no concern with this price point this year. It's solely the $5.2 million that's just dead cap next year, which is why a new contract could happen. If the Lions could potentially get more money to those non-prorated bonus that he does have, more money into this season versus next year, it could make this make even more sense. So for me, unless you were going to get like Pay on a cheaper extension, which is not very likely, then you kind of have that piece already here. So you might as well keep him.